If we're not even doing the most damage, then what's even the point of maining Dark Knight? What went wrong with Dark Knight? Depending on who you ask, the Shadowbringers rework was the start on a path downhill, while others feel this was where Dark Knight finally became what it needed to be. Yet others see Dark Knight as a job in a position where if it is strong, then you bring it. If it's not, well, it's kind of boring, so why bother anyway? So what exactly is wrong or right with Dark Knight now? There are a few topics to cover, so let's talk about it. What happened? At the moment, Dark Knight is, among the tanks, a job that has garnered a reputation for being weirdly fragile, not to mention lacking in self-sustaining capability, which mainly comes from more casual content situations, as Dark Knight's defensive toolkit is a bit weirder than the competition. And Dark Knight does, in fact, have less self-sustainability than the other tanks. It also has a reputation for having an advantage over the other tanks, especially in fights with heavier use of magic damage mechanics thanks to Dark Mind. And Dark Knight also has a reputation for being among the jobs in the game with some of the heaviest burst, to the degree that Dark Knight, and only Dark Knight among tanks, are considered when optimizing Astrologian's melee damage boosting cards, allowing it to compete with melee DPS for this boost. Finally, Dark Knight is also known to have a particularly boring filler rotation, with little to nothing to maintain or worry about building. So how did we get here? In a way, Dark Knight had two truly different versions of it, the Heavensward to Stormblood version and the Shadowbringers to present day version. So let's talk about some of the key features of these different versions to get a greater perspective. Originally, in Heavensward, Dark Knight had two core mechanics it focused on that the other two tanks didn't. The first one, which is probably a lot more surprising, is that Dark Knight focused on parrying, or more precisely, had actions that relied on it. Dark Dance was a defensive cooldown that increased parry chance by 20%. Not that impressive compared to Gunbreaker's Camouflage giving 50% and mitigation nowadays. Low Blow was an ability that did some damage and stunned the target for 5 seconds, and had a chance to instantly reset its cooldown when you parried. And Reprisal was a single target ability that did decent damage, lowered the target's damage output for a while, but could only be used after parrying. One of these actions were removed as early as Stormblood, Dark Dance, and the other two lost their parry interactions and were remade into roll actions at that same time, meaning Dark Knight sort of lost this parry interaction with Stormblood. The other core mechanic the old Dark Knight played with was careful MP management. Originally, Darkside was a buff you toggled that made you do more damage and enabled access to certain actions. For instance, Dark Dance could only be used while Darkside was active. Activating Darkside cost some MP, and maintaining it cost additional MP every 3 seconds. Dark Arts was another ability that cost MP that could only be used during Darkside, that improved the effect of the next action you performed that had Dark Arts interactions. For example, using Dark Dance with Dark Arts made it also increase dodge chance, bosses can't miss though. To rattle off the full list, at least as of the final version of the mechanic in Stormblood, Bloodspiller did 140 more potency, Power Slash, the enmity combo finisher, did even more enmity and did 140 more potency, Plunge did 140 more potency, Soul Eater did 140 more potency, which was more relevant in Heavensward as Soul Eater's healing was lifesteal and not a separate cure potency. Dark Mind's magic damage reduction was doubled. Dark Passenger, a frontal line AoE similar to Flood of Darkness, but on a cooldown and with an MP cost, did 140 more potency and blinded enemies. Abyssal Drain gained its lifestealing component. It cost MP and normally just did damage, and back then didn't have a cooldown. And Carve and Spit went from a wimpy attack that restored MP into a 450 potency attack that did not restore anything. Furthermore, to add to the MP management angle, both Unmend and Unleash also cost MP at the time. Effectively, Dark Arts enabled the Dark Knight to both access superior offense and defense during their dark side, which, due to its startup cost, was optimally done in bursts, but due to the maintenance cost, simply dumping it all into Dark Arts immediately was perhaps not always the right choice in Heavensward. Come Stormblood, Darkside no longer had an upkeep cost, and instead simply stopped your passive MP recovery and prevented you from recovering MP from any other sources but yourself. Siphon Strike, Blood Weapon, and Blood Price, a defensive version of Blood Weapon that recovered MP on being hit. Stormblood sort of replaced the parrying mechanic with managing TBN, however, considering both Dark Dance and Dark Passenger served as lower level defensive options alongside Low Blow and Reprisal, it really underlines why Dark Knight's defensive toolkit feels a bit hollow at low levels before you get TBN to replace them. Now, a thing that sort of started happening is that players began to realize that spending all of the MP resources on attacking over defending tended to be superior, with the exception that Dark Arts boosted Abyssal Drain was like a more flexible, but perhaps slightly weaker version of current day Warriors Bloodwetting for AoE. This led to a situation where it was considered bad or wasteful to use Dark Arts for its defensive potential, as you could have used other options that didn't cost you damage output. This, of course, didn't apply to all players, but it does explain a lot about how Dark Knight changed into what it is today. A final note is that in Stormblood, TBN had an MP cost, yes, but if it successfully popped, it instead gave you 50 blood gauge, so not so much a refund as more a converter. And the reason why I didn't mention Dark Knight's Scourge Dot is because it was simply one of many jobs that lost a random dot in their toolkit in this transition. Before Shadowbringers, physical jobs generally had their AoE capacity limited by running out of TP. Dark Knight instead used MP for its AoE, to still be limited somehow. With Shadowbringers doing away with TP, Dark Knight of course also no longer had to pay MP for any of its spells. Darkside and Dark Arts were also reworked, with Dark Arts becoming the freebie payoff quote-unquote of TBN breaking, and Darkside being a buff maintained by using the new Edge and Flood of Darkness and Shadow, these three actions being the only way to spend MP. Attack, AoE attack, and defensive option that notably refunds itself if used correctly. Abyssal Drain was also changed from being an alternative, more aggressive and self-sustaining spammable AoE attack to being a cooldown shared with Carven Spit. In fact, the only differences between the Shadowbringers and Dawntrail versions of Dark Knight, minus of course new action additions and sometimes levels that actions are learned, are the following. 1. Shadow Stride was plunge and did damage. 2. Living Shadow cost 50 blood gauge. 3. Salted Earth was a placed AoE you could choose where you placed. 4. Blood Weapon was a separate cooldown from Delirium. Lasted 10 seconds, but gave MP per weapon skill or spell. 5. Delirium similarly lasted 10 seconds and made Bloodspell and Quietus, as many as you could fit, free, and the cooldown was 90 seconds. 6. Carven Spit did not heal. 7. Abyssal Drain healed for way less. And 8. Dark Mind and Dark Missionary did not reduce physical damage taken. What does all that even mean? Before Shadowbringers, Dark Knight was, like a lot of jobs, a lot more about maintenance and had a lot more options in its toolkit, in a way. With the sheer amount of changes to Dark Knight, nowadays you don't really have much to maintain outside of bursts, which importantly makes Dark Knight a very different experience in casual content and in more coordinated Savage groups. For a more casual player, before Dawntrail, you'd have a plunge to use as an extra interspersed attack every 30 seconds, and you could use Edge of Flood about as often too, to break up the monotony of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Of course, the plunge part is gone now. For a coordinated player, due to how much MP a Dark Knight can store, this typically means that you spend around 40 to 45 seconds just doing 1, 2, 3s with 1, maybe 2 Blood Spillers in there. Then you have Delirium and perhaps 1 or 2 Edges of Shadow to maintain Darksight, alongside of course Calvin Spit. Then you have another 40 or so seconds of 1-2-3s with 1 or 2 Blood Spillers. And then all hell breaks loose for about 20 seconds. Of course, sometimes the monotony of the filler is broken up by Salted Earth coming up. Thematically, this idea of the Dark Knight overwhelming the enemy in this explosion of power seems fitting, but it's a bit of a shame that to balance it out, it leads to this very long period where not that much is happening. Besides, the pre-Shadowbringers, nay, the pre-Stormblood version of the job, where it was almost more about carefully managing the balance and not being overtaken, quote-unquote, by the dark side and fizzling out completely, possibly fit better thematically with the job. Now, that's neither here nor there, when what really matters is whether it is fun to play, right? Is this a good thing? Dark Knight is among a couple of jobs, the most notable other one being Ninja, where outside of the minute bursts, nothing is really happening. A commonly noted benefit of this is that these jobs can fully focus on dealing with boss mechanics during this extreme filler. Another benefit is that as long as downtime, where you have no attackable target, takes place outside of the minute bursts, then these jobs are mostly unaffected by said downtime, where a lot of other jobs really want to be somewhere specific in their combo sequence or need to generate a certain amount of resources for their bursts to even work right, or even have stuff going on every 30 seconds. These kinds of benefits can be very valuable in harder content where some players may not have the capacity to both keep an eye on complex mechanics and mash out their complex rotation at the same time. Plus the fact that the jobs are simply less impacted by mechanics getting in the way in the first place. Yet another advantage to Dark Knight specifically is that having a significant portion of its attack options be either a resource spender in the form of MP or on charges in the case of Shadowbreaker grants Dark Knight a level of damage output flexibility that few other jobs have the ability to compare to, which can be relevant for more janky coordination like fitting extra damage inside a raid buff that comes out off schedule in, say, casual content, or when something goes sideways in harder content, or if an intermission calls for some damage but not all the damage, like for instance during Watery Grave in M10S, bro. It is also worth mentioning that outside of somewhat specific exceptions, Dark Knight is typically a strong, solid tank to bring to hard content, and while it may be more lacking in defensive options compared to the competition when it comes to big AoE pulls and dungeons, played well and correctly, Dark Knight is perfectly capable of performing mostly like the other tanks, and even brings its own benefit to the field, notably bigger burst, which can be helpful too. So how is any of this really a problem? The problems, quote-unquote, with Dark Knight are sort of complicated to really touch on, because for some, they simply are not problems. For others, they make the job seemingly unplayable, and for yet others, it doesn't actually matter whether the job has problems or not, if it does the mostest damage in the land. The first, more casually known issue with Dark Knight that may simply not exist when it comes to higher-end players is the suggestion that Dark Knight is fragile. While yes, Dark Knight is significantly behind both Gunbreaker and Paladin in mitigation percent capability, just like Warrior, Dark Knight has plenty of ways to reduce damage. A way Dark Knight's weakness in self-sustain can be highlighted in harder content when compared to its peers is that Dark Knight may require an extra heal from an outside source here and there, where the other tanks may require less. Where Dark Knight's fragility stands out a lot more is in casual content, as while Warrior makes up for the lesser mitigation percent by being nigh unkillable on AoE pulls, Dark Knight has to work twice as hard to be more like a Gunbreaker or Paladin, which is also fine, but it ain't no Warrior. This is further emphasized by the fact Dark Knight gets a lot of their mitigation options later than everyone else. Dark Mind is learned later than both Camouflage and Thrill of Battle, TBN is learned much later than Shiltron and Raw Intuition, and slightly later than Heart of Stone. TBN, uniquely among these options, also coming at a cost, also often leads to less experienced Dark Knights simply not using it at all, or because the barrier is perhaps less useful than actual mitigation percent in an AoE pool, determine that it isn't that helpful and choose to just not use it. The aesthetic of dark magic wielding greatsword user may also attract a lot of players that don't really care for the fact that they signed up to be a tank. They just wanted that big sword. This produces a reputation of the job being a lot weaker defensively than it actually is. Somewhat similar to how we covered in a previous video that White Mage appears weaker than it actually is due to its position gathering a lot more inexperienced players too. The second, much more complicated problem with Dark Knight is that, on the one hand, some players love that the job acts in bursts and then just chills for 40 seconds. On the other hand, there are definitely a substantial amount of players that take issue with this design, and it would not surprise me if some portion of these players may be some of those that remember the Heavensward days of more management and needing to react to parries and whatnot, and maintain a dot with, get this, a duration of a mere 18 seconds. What makes this particular problem extra interesting to me is that, at least from personal observations, so take this with a grain of salt, the time where Dark Knight's boring rotation, quote-unquote, has come up the most is specifically when Dark Knight is not doing the most, or at least second most damage among the tanks. A particular quote that stuck with me went something along the lines of, if we're not doing the most damage, then what's even the point of maining Dark Knight? Where of course the answer to that question is a simple, to have fun. But if you're not having fun playing the job, or if the fun part is dependent on you doing the most damage, then it becomes difficult to enjoy Dark Knight when you are not able to do the most damage. This particular complaint stood out the most to me around the launch of Dawntrail, where due to various factors, Dark Knight was a step behind the other tanks, which led to a surprising amount of videos being made specifically complaining about Dark Knight's boring rotation. Then Dark Knight got some potency buffs, and then either the interest in discussing Dark Knight's rotation ended, or it was no longer considered boring now that it was at the top again. You choose how to interpret it. It is worth mentioning also that, as mentioned before, while Dark Knight is perfectly fine mitigation-wise, it is typically considered weaker defensively than, again, Paladin and Gunbreaker, so from an optimizer's standpoint, why indeed bring Dark Knight if it is both weaker defensively and offensively, even if only by a tiny bit? The Yoinky Sploinky. One sort of aside I would be remiss to neglect to mention is the fact that for those that played Dark Knight since the very beginning, in a lot of ways it may feel like a lot of the things Dark Knight doesn't have is because it was given to someone else. For example, Dark Knight no longer has parry interactions at all, the only job that does, Gunbreaker with camouflage. Dark Knight no longer has a relatively spammable self-healing attack that scales with targets, but Warrior does in Bloodwedding. Dark Knight's Delirium was changed from a more unique effect to be almost like a diet version of Warrior's Inner Release. Dark Knight was the first to have a gap closer among tanks, and now it is among the two tanks that no longer deals damage with their gap closer. Both Low Blow and Reprisal are role actions that were lifted from Dark Knight too. To the point, for many long-time Dark Knight mains, it may feel a lot like Dark Knight was robbed of many of its cool features to give away to other jobs, even more so than the other tanks. What could be done? This one will be a bit subjective, but are there ways that Dark Knight's current predicament could be helped? Possibly. So let me rattle off some ideas. At present, Dark Knight is the only tank that doesn't have an OGCD attack precisely on a 30-second cooldown. Upheaval, Expiation, Blasting Zone being clear examples of it. It doesn't have to be a 30-second cooldown, but having an OGCD that you regularly have to check in on may make the filler part of the rotation feel less monotonous, considering this complaint about a bland 1-2-3 combo is one that, while it exists for a lot of jobs, is much less prevalent for the other tanks than for Dark Knight. Another thing that might help is adding a bit more to the odd minute burst, whether by moving Salted Earth to a 60-second cooldown, or by adding or adjusting something else. Just for comparison's sake, before Gunbreaker's recent changes, its odd minute burst still included Sonic Break Double Down and a full Gnashing Fang combo. Dark Knight, on the other hand, gets Carven Spit and a Delirium combo. Sometimes Salted Earth will come up during it, and sometimes an Edge of Shadow may be vented here anyway. Same with the Bloodspiller, but it really emphasizes how little is really there when you go into the odd minute burst, and it's kind of just a 1, 2, 3 and done. It doesn't have to be like the other tanks where they essentially just have a 1 minute burst, but it would be nice if Dark Knight's odd minute burst had just a little bit more. I also feel like, despite Delirium having some uniqueness to it compared to Inner Release now, with Delirium generating a bunch of MP and turning the spenders into different attacks, it still isn't avoiding the fact that for many players, it still feels like discount Inner Release. I'm not entirely sure what you can do to make it not feel that way anymore at this point, as adding more attack steps to it would just make it feel like adding Primal Rend or Primal Ruination equivalents to it. So maybe trying to give it something Inner Release doesn't already have could help. Maybe turning Delirium into an OGCD attack with a short cooldown that you can use a few times during it could work. It would feel more similar to Gunbreaker's continuation, or the early Dawntrail version of Nastron from Dragoon, but it could make Dark Knight have some more weaves. On the other hand, Dark Knight already has a lot there. The final thing is that I think it would be cool if Dark Knight got some more flexibility about MP spending again, with 2 particular suggestions. The first being adding a second charge to TBN, and allowing the Dark Knight to hold 2 Dark Arts stacks, giving the Dark Knight more room to weave this when they feel it is needed. The other idea being adding other defensively inclined ways to spend MP, similar to how, for instance, Dark Mind used to have the ability to have its effect doubled by the old Dark Arts. Considering the current design, these defensive options would probably also have to build towards Dark Arts stacks so you don't lose damage by playing defensively, but I think it would be a start, and would make MP feel less like the Edge and Flood resource. But that said, what do you think? Maybe you like Dark Knight just as it is, or maybe you're actually the kind of player that feels like you can only truly justify yourself playing Dark Knight when it is strong. Or maybe you specifically play it when it is strong, ignoring how it works. Or maybe yet, you don't like how Dark Knight plays now, but used to like it, and have ideas to improve it. Personally, I used to play Dark Knight a lot more in Stormblood and Shadowbringers, so I'm mostly suggesting ideas to help others, and hopefully the Dark Knight mains know better themselves, so please do let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi, links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, despite Carven Spit stating it performs a 3-fold attack, it delivers only 1 single hit, and notably, never delivered more than 1 single hit, so this isn't something that was lost with a patch change. This is in stark contrast to, for example, Ninja's Dream Within a Dream, which not only came out in the same expansion, also states it delivers a 3-fold attack, but actually delivers 3 separate attacks, that incidentally adds up to precisely the same potency as Carven Spit.